Mr. Coburn? Aye. Mr. Durbin? Mr. Durbin? Aye. Mr. Bingaman? Mr. Bingaman? Aye. Mr. Levin? Aye. Mr. Franken? Aye. Mr. Coons? Aye. Mr. Lee? No. Ms. Snow? Aye. Kaka? Aye. Mr. Sanders? No. Mr. Burr? Aye. Mr. Bozeman? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Aye. Mr. Carey? Mr. Carey? Aye. Mr. Casey? Aye. Mr. Inhofe? Aye. Mr. Manchin? Aye. Ms. Udall? Mr. Udall of Colorado? No. Mr. Thune? Aye. Mr. Pryor? Aye. Mr. Heller? No. Mr. Portman? Aye. Mr. Moran? Aye. Ms. Klobuchar? Aye. Ms. Murkowski? No. Mr. Beckidge? No. Mr. Enzi? Aye. Mr. Vitter? Aye. Mr. Harkin? Aye. Mr. Cardin, aye. Risch? Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, no.
Are there any senators wishing to vote or to change their vote?
Mr. Bingaman? No.
What should I say? What do you want? On this vote, the ayes are 74, the nays are 13, one announced present. The motion to table is agreed to. The Majority Leader. Please move your conversation out of the well. The Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. President, I now ask the Chair to lay before the Senate a message from the House with respect to S-990.
The Clerk will report.
Resolved that the bill from the Senate S-990 entitled an act to provide for an additional temporary extension of programs under the Small Business Act and the Small Business Investment Act of 1958 and for other purposes do pass with an amendment.
The message is laid before the Senate.
I move to concur in the House amendment to S-990. With an amendment, I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The Clerk will report the motions.
The Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, moves to concur in the House amendment to S-990 with an amendment numbered 347. Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion to concur in the House amendment to S-990 with an amendment numbered 347, signed by 17 senators as follows. Reed of Nevada. Reed of Rhode Island.
Unanimous consent that reading the names be waived.
Without objection.
I now ask for the yeas and nays on my amendment.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The yeas and nays are ordered.
I have a second-degree amendment to the desk, Mr. President.
The Clerk will report.
The Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, proposes an amendment numbered 348 to amendment numbered 347.
Mr. President, I have a motion to refer the House message to the Senate Small Business Committee with instruction to report back forthwith with an amendment.
The Clerk will report the motion.
The Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, moves to refer the House message to the Committee on Small Business with instructions to report back forthwith with an amendment numbered 349.
On that, Mr. President, I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be.
Mr. President, I have...
The yeas and nays are ordered.
Mr. President, I have an amendment to my instructions, which is also at the desk.
The Clerk will report.
The Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, proposes an amendment numbered 350 to the instructions of the motion to refer.
On that, Mr. President, I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The yeas and nays are ordered.
I have a second-degree amendment to my instructions, which is at the desk.
The Clerk will report the amendment.
The Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, proposes an amendment numbered 351 to amendment numbered 350.
Would note the absence of quorum.
The Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
President,
The Majority Leader.
I ask consent to call the quorum be terminated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, there will be no more roll call votes tonight. The absence of quorum.
The Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
1983, an act to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to extend the funding and expenditure authority of the Airport and Airway Trust Fund, to amend Title 49, United States Code, to extend the Airport Improvement Program, and for other purposes.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be read 3 times and passed. The motion to reconsider be laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, and any statements related to the bill be placed in the record at the appropriate place as if read.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
I rise to address the four-year extension of the PATRIOT Act and to oppose that extension if the bill is not modified. And I want to take us back to the principles on which our nation was founded. And indeed, before our Declaration of Independence, before our Constitution, there was a deep tradition of the right of privacy. And let's take William Pitt's declaration in 1763. He said, "The poorest may, in his cottage, bid his defiance to all the forces of the crown. The storm may enter, the rain may enter, but the King of England may not enter." And it is the philosophy embedded in William Pitt's declaration of the sanctity of a man's home that underwrote the principle of the Fourth Amendment. And that reads as follows: "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized." The Fourth Amendment is powerful protection of personal privacy from the overreach of government. And how does that compare and contrast to the PATRIOT Act that is before us? Let me tell you the standard that is in the PATRIOT Act for the government to seize your papers, to search your papers. And that standard is simply relevance to an investigation. Now, relevance to an investigation, that's the legal standard that was set out in the PATRIOT Act. That is a standard that was written to be as broad and low as possible. What does it mean to be relevant to an investigation? It certainly isn't something as strong as probable cause, which is in the Fourth Amendment. It certainly isn't describing the place to be searched, the persons and things to be seized. Indeed, the word relevant doesn't have a foundation of legal tradition that provides any boundaries at all. Now let's take the term investigation. Investigation is in the eye of the beholder. I want to look into something. It's an investigation. So what happens to these words in the PATRIOT Act, in this section of the PATRIOT Act that addresses the sweeping powers to investigate Americans down to the books they check out, their medical records, their private communications? Quite simply, there is a process in theory in which a court known as the FISA court makes a determination. But they make the determination upon this standard. Then this standard is relevant to an investigation. Now, the interpretation of that clause is done in secret. I would defy you to show me a circumstance where a secret interpretation of a very minimal standard is tightened in that secret process. But we don't know, because we're not being told. This is why I support Senator Wyden's amendment. Senator Wyden said we shouldn't have secret law, secret interpretation of clauses that may result in the opposite of what we believe is being done. And that is a very important amendment, but that amendment will not be debated on the floor of the Senate. Now, it won't be debated because a very clever mechanism has just been put into play to prevent amendments from being offered and debated on the floor of the Senate on the 4-year extension of the PATRIOT Act. And quite frankly, I'm very disturbed by that mechanism, a parliamentary move in which a House message is brought over, and that message, the regular bill is tabled, that message will then have the regular PATRIOT Act put into it as a privileged motion, and it will be returned to the House. And the effect therein is because the tree has been filled, which is parliamentary speak for no amendments will be allowed, we won't get to debate Senator Wyden's amendment. And there are a number of senators who have proposed to change this standard relevant to an investigation, to make it a legally significant standard, to make sure that it isn't being secretly interpreted to mean almost nothing. But we won't have a debate in this Senate over changing that low and insignificant standard into a meaningful legal standard with teeth in it that has court cases behind what it means, interpretations that will protect us. Now, there is no question that every member of this chamber takes enormous sense of responsibility in the security of our nation. And in that sense, there's a significant feeling on every person's part that we need to enable our intelligence services, we need to enable our military to do the necessary work to protect our nation. But that does not mean we should avoid having a debate about whether the PATRIOT Act, as written today, without an amendment, rolls over the top of the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution of the United States of America. Because we can have both personal privacy and a high standard is set out in the Fourth Amendment for the seizure of papers and security. Those two things are not at war with each other. We have had 2 centuries in this nation of embracing the twins of personal privacy and security. We've made that work. We can continue to make it work. So I rise in protest about the process that is unfolding on the floor of the Senate in which amendments will not be presented and will not be debated. And I rise to say that the Fourth Amendment matters, that it set a significant standard against unreasonable seizures and searches, and that the PATRIOT Act, as written, does not provide a clear implementation of the Fourth Amendment, a clear protection of the Fourth Amendment. So I will close by noting that it has been nearly 250 years since William Pitt declared that the poorest may, in his cottage, bid his defiance to all the forces of the crown. The storm may enter, the rain may enter, but the King of England may not enter. Let us have a debate in this chamber about modifications that protect our security, but that hold faith with the principle William Pitt enunciated and with the principle we adopted in the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, that the right of the people against unreasonable seizure and search shall not be violated. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President,
Senator from Illinois.
ask consent the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Mr. President, last week, the chairman of the House Budget Committee, Paul Ryan of Wisconsin, came to Chicago to speak to the Economic Club and to articulate his vision, the Republican vision, on how to reduce our nation's debt. It was an interesting speech because Congressman Ryan's budget, the Republican budget, which passed the House of Representatives, has become an object of debate and controversy. I know Congressman Ryan, and we served together on the President's Deficit Commission. I know he is a very thoughtful and learned and sincere individual. But I certainly have to say that his approach to dealing with our budget deficit is one that I believe falls short of the mark. It would seem to me that if we are serious about our deficit, and we should be, we should acknowledge the fact that out of every dollar that we spend in Washington, we borrow 40 cents. That is unsustainable, and we have to address it. And we should also look at the grim recent reality of our budget. When President William Jefferson Clinton left office a little over 10 years ago and handed the keys to the White House over to President George W. Bush, the accumulated net deficit debt, I should say, of America was $5 trillion. $5 trillion. 8 years later, in the next transfer of power, when President George W. Bush transferred power to President Obama, America's accumulated net debt had now reached a new level of $11 trillion. More than doubled in 8 years period of time. And you ask yourself, how could that occur? Well, the answers are fairly obvious. When you wage two wars and don't pay for them, when you cut taxes in the midst of the war, the first time that has ever happened in our history, and when you pass programs that are not paid for, it adds to our debt. That's what happened. And so President Obama inherited a dramatic increase in the national debt and a very weak economy, losing hundreds of thousands of jobs a month. Now we find we're even deeper in debt, closer to $14 trillion because of this recession, despite the best efforts of Congress and the President to turn it around. And we know that it has to change. The major creditor of the United States of America is China, and it is also our major competitor. And those two realities force us to look honestly at this deficit. I take exception to the approach that the Republicans used in their deficit reduction. Because when I took a look at the Congressman Ryan's Republican budget, I find that at the end of the day, they cut spending, or nominally cut spending, by $4 trillion over a 10-year period of time, yet only cut $8 billion a year out of the defense budget. The defense budget of the United States is over $500 billion every year. They could only find $8 billion a year to cut. Not a very serious undertaking. They raised no new revenues to help pay down the debt, while they dramatically cut taxes for the wealthiest people and companies in America. In the name of deficit reduction, the Republican budget would cut the top tax rate on the wealthiest individuals and corporations to 25%. The Tax Policy Center estimates this would reduce tax revenues by $2.9 trillion over the next 10 years, and virtually all of the tax savings from that change would go to households making an annual income of over $200,000 a year. Why does a multi-trillion-dollar tax cut have to do with deficit reduction? Congressman Ryan, in a speech in Chicago, criticized the Democrats for engaging in class warfare, as if it is somehow inappropriate to point out that the Republican budget proposes a massive shift in wealth from the poor and middle class to those who are better off. Warren Buffett, the man who is CEO of Berkshire Hathaway, the seer of Omaha, answered that criticism best a few years ago. And he said, quote, "There's class warfare, all right, but it's my class, the rich class, that's making war and winning." And that's what happens with the Republican budget. And then there's the issue of health care, an issue near and dear to every single American. A serious budget plan would address the largest cause of the projected long-term debt for the federal government, health care, by allowing dozens of cost containment provisions in the Affordable Care Act to take effect, and then by finding even more to reduce the cost of the system. But the House Republican budget plan does just the opposite. It repeals all the cost containment mechanisms, which the Congressional Budget Office says, in doing, will raise the debt of America. Then the Republican budget goes a step further. It ends Medicare and Medicaid as we know them, as programs that serve America. Their budget would transform programs that seniors and the poor count on today to provide adequate health insurance into programs that help to cover just some of the costs, leaving the rest of the bills to the families, individuals, and state governments. All that the Republican budget plan does under the banner of health reform is to shift the cost of health care from American families who are paying taxes to other American families who are paying taxes in the private market. It would do nothing to reduce health care costs as a whole. It is fair to ask me at this point, well, if you are going to be a critic of the Republican budget, what do you suggest? And I'll tell you what I suggest. I've sat around for 4 months plus now with 5 of my Senate colleagues of both political parties working on these ideas. And what I think is the path to a reasonable deficit reduction is one that literally involves shared sacrifice, where every American has to be prepared to step up and accept the reality that things will change. Mr. President, there is one demographic reality that overshadows this conversation. Since January 1st of this year, every day, 9,000 Americans reach the age of 65. That trend will continue for 19 more years. That's the baby boom generation. If you'll do the math, you'll see a dramatic increase in people under Social Security and Medicare as those children born immediately after World War II reach retirement age. That's a reality. What do we do about it? First, we make sure Social Security can be counted on. Social Security does not add 1 penny to our nation's debt. It is a separate fund. It will make every promised payment for another 25 years with a cost of living adjustment, but then runs into trouble. And you'll see a reduction, if we don't do something, in the 26th year by over 20% for each benefit payment. Unacceptable. So we should think in honest terms about what we do today, small changes we can make today in Social Security, which played out over 25 years, like the miracle of compound interest, buy us an even longer life for Social Security. I think there are ways to do that. There are reasonable ways to do that. For example, when we passed Social Security reform in 1983, we said that 90% of wages in America should be subject to Social Security taxation. Over the years, by not raising the ceiling on wages that could be taxed for Social Security, we have fallen behind the 90% standard. I think we're close to 84% now. If we go back to the 90% standard, which I think is reasonable, and raise the eligible income in America for Social Security deductions up to 90%, it'll move us toward solvency, more solvency for Social Security. It's money that will not be used to reduce the deficit, but will be used to invest in Social Security. I think that makes sense. There are other things we can do that are reasonable changes. We also have to look at Medicare and Medicaid and acknowledge the obvious. The cost of health care is going up too fast. We can't keep up with it. Neither can state governments, local governments, businesses, or unions, or families. And so the cost containment and health care reform is just the beginning, but we need to continue the conversation. And we need spending cuts. Let's be very honest about it. We have taken a pretty significant cut in domestic discretionary spending just this year, even more than the Bowles and Simpson Commission envisioned. And there's some risk associated with spending cuts in the midst of recession. But now we need to ask the defense or military side of discretionary spending to also make some sacrifice. I think one obvious way is to start bringing our troops home from overseas, bring them home from Iraq. It is estimated that it costs us $1 million per year for every soldier in the field, for all of the support that goes into training and sustaining and protecting our men and women in uniform, which we must do. But it's an expensive commitment. And as we reduce our troop commitments overseas, the amount of money being spent through the Pentagon will be reduced as well. We need to take a close look at all of the private contractors working for the Pentagon. Mr. President, we had a hearing of this deficit commission and asked the experts, well, you can tell us how many employees there are at the Department of Defense, civilian, military. How many private contractors are working for our Department of Defense? And the expert said, I have no idea. I can't even get close to giving you an estimate. But it's a dramatically larger number. We can reduce that spending, and we should. The point I'm making is that after we have taken care of the entitlement programs and the spending issues, that isn't enough. We need to talk about revenue, revenue that can be brought into deficit reduction. Every year, our tax code gives deductions and credits, exclusions and special treatment that account for $1.1 trillion that it would otherwise have flowed to the Treasury. Instead, it is money that isn't paid into taxes and into our government. We can reduce that tax expenditure and do it in a fair fashion by reforming the tax code in a meaningful way. And, as the Bowles-Simpson Commission suggested, bring down tax rates as part of this conversation. That, to me, is a reasonable approach. It parallels what was done in the Bowles-Simpson Commission, putting everything on the table and reducing our deficit over the next 10 years by at least $4 trillion. I think we can do it, and we should do it, on a bipartisan basis. The Republican budget plan, unfortunately, takes the wrong approach. The House Republicans have proposed, among other things, a fundamental change in how we pay for health care. It turns Medicaid into a block grant program, and it eliminates the Affordable Health Care Act. Mr. President, one of the sources of pride we all shared was the notion that 30 million Americans currently uninsured would have insurance protection under the Affordable Health Care Act. What the Republicans do in repealing it is to add to the number of uninsured in America, thus making it clear they have no place to turn in their extreme situations, but to Medicaid. So on top of eliminating the Affordable Health Care Act, adding to the number of uninsured Americans, the Republican plan then limits the amount of money to spend on Medicaid. The net result, more and more people uninsured seeking Medicaid help with no funds to pay for their medical treatment. That is not a good vision for the future of America. We had a presentation today at our Democratic caucus lunch. The presentation was made by Senator Kent Conrad, the chairman of our Budget Committee. He and Senator Stabenow of Michigan talked about what the Medicare changes would mean in America, and what it basically means is the average senior citizen under the Republican budget plan will see their Medicare benefits cut and will find their out-of-pocket expenses to maintain current Medicare protection double, over $12,000 a year. Now, there are many, many seniors in Oregon and Illinois and across the nation on fixed incomes. That is not a reasonable alternative. $1,000 a month on Medicare insurance premiums, that's the Republican budget plan. It is not a reasonable way to deal with our future challenges in health care. Mr. President, we'll have a chance to vote this week on the Republican budget plan, and it'll be interesting to see how many on the other side of the aisle want to support the approaches that I've just described. Already, some of them have announced they won't. They think it goes too far. I do too. I hope on a bipartisan basis we can reject the House Republican plan, but then let's come together in a bipartisan fashion and try to find a reasonable way to deal with this deficit. I hope we'll use the Bowles-Simpson Commission as a starting point, because I think it's a good one. And let's maintain some fealty to our values as a country that really takes care of the vulnerable, which we will always have among us, and makes a pledge that our tax code will be progressive so that working families have a fighting chance, and tries to at least share the burden of sacrifice in a reasonable and just manner. Those who are better off should pay more. Those who are less well off should pay less. I don't think that's an extreme position. I think it's a sensible, humane position. So, Mr. President, our debate begins this week on the budget. We have a great challenge ahead of us. I hope that some of the work we did in the Deficit Commission will help us reach a positive conclusion. I yield, suggest the absence of